The handcuffs were cold. I remember that detail specifically, not because it was the worst part, but because it was the most surreal. The metal against my wrists. The sound of the clasp locking. The way the officer said, "Ma'am, please don't resist," in a tone that suggested he was as uncomfortable as I was. I was standing in the foyer of my father's estate, the house I had grown up in, the house where I had learned to ride a bicycle on the back lawn, where I had gotten ready for prom in the upstairs bathroom with the clawfoot tub, where I had sat with my father at the kitchen table every Sunday morning for 23 years while he read the paper and I did my homework, and we said nothing to each other because nothing needed to be said. That house, that foyer, those marble floors. And there were 2 officers, and there was my father's estate attorney looking like he might need medical attention, and there were 11 relatives seated in the formal living room who had come for the reading of my father's will, all of them watching through the open doorway, and there was my stepmother, Diane, standing 4 feet away from me in a cream-colored Chanel suit, her hand pressed to her chest in a performance of distress, so polished I almost admired it. "She forced her way in," Diane said to the officer. "I told her the family gathering was private. She became threatening. I was frightened for my safety. I had not forced my way in. I had used my key, the key my father had given me the day he handed me a copy of his estate documents and said, 'This house will always be yours to enter. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise.'" I looked at Diane across that marble foyer and I thought about that key and I thought about what he had said, and I made a decision in that moment that would define everything that followed. I said nothing. I allowed them to walk me to the patrol car. I sat in the back seat with my wrists bound and my posture straight and my expression completely, entirely, surgically composed. Because I had read my father's will, all 37 pages, and I already knew what Diane had just done to herself. My name is Caroline Ashworth Price. I am 38 years old. I am a licensed structural engineer with a firm in Atlanta, and I am the only biological child of Raymond Harold Ashworth, who died on September 3rd of last year at the age of 71 from complications following a second cardiac event. My father was a self-made man in the most complete sense of that phrase. He had grown up in a 2-bedroom house in rural Virginia, built a civil engineering company from 12 employees to over 400, sold it in 2009 for a figure that I will not state here out of respect for his privacy, and spent the following decade managing his investments with the quiet discipline of a man who had earned every dollar and intended to be thoughtful about where they went. He married my mother, Patricia, in 1982. She died when I was 9. Ovarian cancer. 14 months from diagnosis to the end. He did not remarry for 19 years. When he married Diane Kellerman Ashworth in 2012, I was 26 years old, living in Atlanta, and mature enough to approach the situation without the dramatics of a threatened child. I did not hate Diane. I did not sabotage the relationship. I attended the wedding. I was civil at every holiday, and I kept my observations about her behavior, her accelerating interest in his finances, her systematic distancing of his oldest friendships, her habit of referring to his estate in the first-person plural before they had been married 2 years to myself. Because my father was happy, or appeared to be. It was only in the last 18 months of his life, as his health declined and Diane's management of his calendar, his correspondence, and his social access became increasingly total, that I began to understand what I was actually watching. And it was only when my father called me in April, 8 months before he died, and asked me to fly to Richmond for the weekend, alone without telling Diane, that I understood he had arrived at the same conclusion. We sat in his study for 3 hours. He showed me documents, and then he introduced me to his attorney, not the firm Diane believed handled his estate planning. A different attorney, a woman named Margaret Chun, of Chun and Fairfield, who had been working with my father in complete confidentiality for 14 months. What they had built together was not simply a will. It was a trap. My father didn't just plan for what he wanted to leave behind. He planned for exactly what Diane would try to do, and he built the consequence directly into the document. After my father died, Diane moved through the estate like a woman who had already won. She changed the door codes at the main house within 72 hours. She retained Gregory Falk of Falk and Holloway, one of Richmond's most aggressive estate litigation attorneys, before my father had been buried for 2 weeks. She called 3 of my father's longest-standing friends to inform them, in what she described as a courtesy call, that Caroline had not been close to Raymond in his final years, and that the family was navigating some difficult dynamics. She was preloading the narrative, and she was good at it. Diane had a particular talent for performing vulnerability. She was 58 years old and striking, and spoke in a soft, measured voice that made everything she said sound like reluctant honesty. She had been a real estate agent before she married my father. She understood the relationship between presentation and perception better than most. What she did not understand, what she had never understood, was that I had been watching her for 10 years. Not obsessively, not with malice, the way an engineer watches a structure. Cataloging, noting load points, identifying where pressure would eventually cause fracture. 3 weeks after my father's death, Diane's attorney sent a formal letter to Margaret Chun demanding a full inventory of estate assets and requesting that the will reading be scheduled at Falk and Holloway's offices, with Diane's legal team present. Margaret responded, politely, that the will reading would take place at my father's residence, as specified in the document itself, a provision my father had included deliberately because he believed certain things should happen in the places where they were earned. Diane agreed. She agreed because she was confident. She had lived in that house for 12 years. She had managed that household. She had assumed, as people who confuse proximity with entitlement often do, that access meant ownership. The morning of the reading, I drove to Richmond from Atlanta. 4 hours and 20 minutes. I arrived at 9:47 a.m., 13 minutes before the scheduled start. I used my key. The rest you already know. She had me removed from my father's home in handcuffs. In front of the family. In front of his attorney. In front of everyone. What she didn't know is that she had just activated the single most consequential clause in a 37-page legal document. Stay with me. I was held at the Richmond City Police Station for 2 hours and 40 minutes. No charges were filed, because there were no charges to file. I had a legal key. I had a documented history of access. The officer who processed my entry later confirmed, in writing, that there was no evidence of forced entry, no evidence of threatening behavior, and no legal basis for the arrest. I was released at 12:23 p.m. My attorney, Margaret Chun, who had driven to the station personally, was waiting in the lobby with a coffee. A copy of my father's will tabbed at 3 specific pages, and the expression of a woman who had been expecting exactly this phone call. It happened, I said. I know, she said. My paralegal was there. We have it documented. She handed me the coffee. How does she seem? I asked. Confident, Margaret said. Gregory Falk is already talking about a spousal elective share challenge. He thinks the primary distribution structure is vulnerable. Let him think that. The reading has been postponed to Thursday. She's agreed to let you attend. A pause. Graciously. She made a point of saying graciously. I drank the coffee. She thinks she won this morning, I said. She does, Margaret confirmed. Good. Because what Diane and Gregory Falk had spent the past 3 weeks preparing to contest was my father's 2019 will, the document they believe controlled his estate. The one that left Diane a $2.1 million outright bequest and a lifetime residency interest in the main house. That will had been superseded. On November 9, 2022, my father had executed a complete testamentary restatement with Margaret Chun. A document so precisely constructed that Margaret had described it, without irony, as the most legally deliberate instrument I've drafted in 26 years of practice. And at the center of that document, nestled between the asset distribution provisions and the charitable trust establishment, was Section 14, Paragraph C. 12 sentences. My father had written the substance of those sentences himself, in longhand, on a legal pad, and handed them to Margaret with the words, I want this to be unambiguous. It was unambiguous. Section 14, Paragraph C contained a single condition. One behavior. One consequence. And Diane had triggered it at 9:58 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, witnessed by 2 police officers, 11 family members, and a paralegal with a notepad. The room was the same as it had been Tuesday. Same 11 relatives. Same chairs arranged in a loose semicircle. Same autumn light coming through the west-facing windows my father had always loved. Different energy. Diane sat at the near end of the room with Gregory Falk beside her and 2 associates arranged behind her like a legal chorus. She was wearing charcoal this time. Still Chanel. She had the controlled composure of someone who had been thoroughly briefed and thoroughly believed the briefing. I sat on the opposite side with Margaret. No associates. One folder. My Uncle James, my father's older brother, who had driven from Charlottesville and who had, I would later learn, quietly despised Diane for the better part of a decade, caught my eye across the room and gave me the smallest possible nod. Margaret opened without preamble. Thank you all for returning. Before we begin the formal reading, I want to note for the record that this proceeding is being documented by my firm and that all parties have been notified of that documentation. Gregory Fawkes shifted. We'd like to address the question of which instrument controls. We'll get there, Margaret said. Not rudely, with the patience of someone who has already finished the conversation in her mind. First, the instrument itself. She read for 11 minutes. The assets summary. $8.3 million in total estate value, including the Richmond residence assessed at $2.1 million, a secondary property in Asheville, a portfolio of municipal bonds, a substantial brokerage account, and a private foundation endowment established in my mother's name. The primary distribution, the foundation endowment, $1.4 million, directed to continue under my stewardship. The Asheville property to me outright. The brokerage account, divided, 70% to me, 30% to a charitable arts organization my father had supported for 15 years. The Richmond residence, to me, with a 12-month right of occupancy for Diane Kellerman Ashworth, contingent on Section 14, paragraph C remaining unsatisfied. Diane's direct bequest, $400,000, structured over 4 years. Gregory Fawkes leaned forward. That's a dramatic departure from the 2019 instrument. Will be challenging. Mr. Fawkes, Margaret said. Section 14, paragraph C. She read it aloud. The room went completely still. The clause stated, in the event that Diane Kellerman Ashworth takes any action, legal, physical, or communicative, that interferes with, delays, or disrupts the legal process of estate administration, or that publicly demeans, restricts access to, or causes harm to the reputation or liberty of Caroline Ashworth Price during the administration period. All bequests designated to Diane Kellerman Ashworth under this instrument, including residency rights, direct financial distributions, and any claims arising from spousal election, shall be null and void, and the entirety of those assets shall be redirected to the Eleanor Patricia Ashworth Foundation. For purposes of this clause, administration period shall begin on the date of the testator's death and conclude upon final probate settlement. This clause requires no judicial finding. It is self-executing upon documented evidence of the triggering behavior as determined solely by the trustee. Diane's face did not collapse. It didn't need to. The color leaving it was enough. She had you arrested, Margaret said quietly, setting the document down, on the morning of the scheduled reading, in the home specified in the will as the reading location, using your legal key. In front of documented witnesses, she opened the folder. Officer testimony, entry log, paralegal affidavit, security footage from the exterior camera, which, for the record, your father installed in 2021 and which remained registered in his name. She placed it on the table. The clause is satisfied. The bequests are void. My father wrote that clause himself, in his own handwriting, on a legal pad, because he knew her. He had always known her, and he waited, patiently, quietly, with love, for me to know her too. Don't go anywhere. Gregory Fawkes did not accept this quietly. Within 5 business days, Fawkes and Holloway filed 3 simultaneous motions: a challenge to the 2022 restatement's validity on grounds of undue influence, a petition for the spousal elective share under Virginia statute, which guarantees a surviving spouse 1/3 of the augmented estate regardless of all provisions, and a motion to invalidate Section 14, paragraph C as an unreasonable forfeiture clause. They were thorough. They were aggressive. They were expensive. They lost. On undue influence, Margaret had constructed the same architecture I had seen used once before. My father had attended all 4 drafting sessions at Margaret's office in downtown Richmond, each documented with time-stamped entry logs, none attended by me, none attended by anyone connected to the estate. His personal physician, Dr. Howard Lattimore, provided a certification of full cognitive capacity dated 7 days before final execution. A handwriting analyst confirmed the longhand notes in the will file matched my father's known writing samples from 2019 through 2022, demonstrating consistent authorship across 3 years. Most decisively, Margaret produced a recorded video statement my father had made voluntarily at her office on November 8, 2022, the day before signing. 9 minutes long. In it, Raymond Harold Ashworth, seated in a conference room chair, in a blue Oxford shirt, looking directly at the camera, explained in his own words, unhurried, clear, precise, why he was making the changes he was making. He named no one unkindly. He made no accusations. He simply stated that his priorities had clarified over time, that he wanted his estate to reflect his actual values rather than his earlier assumptions, and that he was acting entirely of his own volition. He ended the statement with a single sentence that Margaret read into the court record, and that I will carry for the rest of my life. I want Caroline to know that everything I built with her in mind, and I'm sorry it took me this long to make sure the documents said so. On the spousal elective share, Virginia law does permit this claim. Margaret had anticipated it. The total value of assets redirected from Diane to the foundation by Section 14's activation significantly reduced the calculable estate base for elective share purposes, and the foundation, structured as an irrevocable charitable entity, was not subject to elective share calculation under settled Virginia precedent. After legal fees and accounting adjustments, Diane's elective share claim yielded $67,000. Not $2.1 million. $67,000. On Section 14's validity, the court found the clause enforceable. Self-executing forfeiture provisions tied to documented conduct are recognized under Virginia estate law when drafted with sufficient specificity. My father's clause was specific. Margaret had made certain of that. Gregory Falk withdrew all remaining motions on a Friday afternoon in February, 6 months after my father's death. Diane did not call me. She did not need to. Probate closed in March. The Richmond house transferred to my name on March 22nd. Diane's 12-month occupancy right had been voided by the clause activation, and she had vacated the property in January, quietly, without incident, 14 boxes and a moving truck on a Tuesday morning when I was not present because I had chosen not to be there. Not out of cruelty. Out of the same principle my father had lived by. Don't create scenes. Create outcomes. The Eleanor Patricia Ashworth Foundation received the redirected assets, $400,000 in cash distributions and the residency rights convertible value, and I immediately allocated the majority toward expanding the foundation's scholarship program, which my father had established in 2014 to support women pursuing careers in engineering and architecture. In the first year under the expanded endowment, we awarded grants to 16 recipients at 8 universities. My mother had wanted to be an architect. She ran out of time. I thought about that every time I signed a grant approval. The Asheville property, a craftsman house on 3 acres, 45 minutes from the Blue Ridge Parkway, I did not sell. I drove there in April, opened every window, sat on the back porch with coffee, and stayed for 4 days. My father had bought it in 2016. He and Diane had visited it twice. He had visited it alone 6 times after that. I understand now what he was doing there. Looking for quiet. Looking for the version of his life that still felt like his own. I found a legal pad in the desk drawer of the second bedroom. On the first page, in his handwriting, for Caroline, in case you ever need a place to think. I closed the pad. I did not cry this time. I just sat there, in the house he had left me, in the quiet he had loved, and I stayed until I was ready to leave. People ask me what I learned from this. Not the legal mechanics. Those are documented in a case file in the Richmond Circuit Court, and anyone can read them. The actual lesson. The thing underneath the evidence folders and the attorney fees and the self-executing forfeiture clause, and the 9-minute video of my father in a blue Oxford shirt looking directly at a camera. Here is what I learned. My father spent the last years of his life building 2 things simultaneously. The visible thing, managing his illness, maintaining his household, trying to hold his marriage together with the same quiet discipline he applied to everything, and the invisible thing. The thing no one saw. The architecture beneath the architecture. He had watched Diane for 12 years. He had watched her the way I had watched her, cataloging, noting, understanding. And instead of confronting, instead of performing, Instead of creating the kind of dramatic rupture that would have cost him his remaining peace and handed her a narrative of victimhood she would have used brilliantly, he did what engineers do. He designed for the load. He built the structure to absorb the force he knew was coming. And then he handed the keys to the person he trusted to stand inside it. I think about the morning of the arrest often. Standing in that foyer in handcuffs, on my father's marble floors, with Diane 4 feet away performing distress for an audience of 11 relatives and 2 officers. I was not afraid. I was not humiliated. I was watching the clock. Because I knew something Diane had never considered, had never thought to ask, had never imagined was necessary to investigate, which is that the woman she had spent 12 years dismissing as difficult and oversensitive and unable to let go had spent an April weekend in her father's study reading 37 pages of documents and understanding exactly what they meant. She arrested me on a Tuesday morning. By Thursday afternoon, she had lost $2.1 million, a house, a 12-month residency, and every legal claim her very expensive attorney could construct. Not because I was clever, because my father was, and because he knew, as he had always known, since Sunday mornings at the kitchen table with the newspaper and the homework and the silence that didn't need to be filled, exactly who I was. That is not a legal victory. That is a father's last act of love. And the thing I want you to carry from this story, if you're the one who was watched and measured and quietly dismissed, if you're the one who kept showing up and got called difficult for it, if you're the one who held the folder and said nothing when everything in you wanted to speak, is this. Preparation is the most patient form of power. My father knew that. He spent 8 months making sure I would know it too. And in the end, the only thing Diane Kellerman Ashworth accomplished on that Tuesday morning, in her cream-colored suit, in that marble foyer, with her hand pressed to her chest and her performance perfectly calibrated, was sign her own name to the document that took everything from her. My father didn't need to be there to watch it happen. He designed it that way. The foundation has awarded 47 scholarships since March. The house on the Blue Ridge still has every window, and the legal pad in the second bedroom desk stays exactly where I found it, because some things you don't move. You just make sure they're safe. Outro engagement call. If this story found you at the right moment, if you've ever been the one who held it together while someone else performed, leave a comment below. Just 2 words, I stayed. That's all. And if someone in your life has been called difficult for simply knowing their worth, send this to them today. Because the quietest people in the room are often carrying the heaviest files, the foundation has awarded 47 scholarships since March. The house on the Blue Ridge still has every window, and the legal pad in the second bedroom desk stays exactly where I found it, because some things you don't move. You just make sure they're safe. If this story found you at the right moment, if you've ever been the one who held it together while someone else performed, leave a comment below. Just 2 words, I stayed. That's all. And if someone in your life has been called difficult for simply knowing their worth, send this to them today. Because the quietest people in the room are often carrying the heaviest files.